So, should I have prefaced this more? Can we put this at the start? I love fantasy stuff, and today I want to talk about that. And yes, this is that video. Okay, that should go at the start.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I'm very sorry about that.
We are here today.
We are here.
Why did I start that as if it was a funeral?
Welcome to the episode 2. This week we are going to be talking about fantasy movies and TV shows and fantasy media in general.
That really sold it.
Did it?
No.
Okay. So, Vegard, the first thing I wanted to do, that I wanted to chat about, and this was not going to be a forced conversation, this is going to be a very natural conversation. So, what do you think makes up your typical fantasy thing?
That it's not real.
I was just going to discuss, okay, what would we consider fantasy? But I actually made notes, so I'm really strongly in the advantage here because I have a page of stuff I think one of the main features...
I don't think you've finished a sentence yet.
So I think one of the main features that makes up a fantasy is mythical creatures.
But not for every single one.
No, but I think that's... I wouldn't say it's a necessity, but it's a very common for them to feature mythical creatures in some way. Yeah, it's not compulsory for them to have mythical creatures, but it's common. So, you've got elves, fairies, pixies, vampires, werewolves, unicorns, mermaids, giants, goblins,
Are you gonna
dwarves,
list every mythical
hobbits,
creature?
and most importantly, dragons.
So is this a fantasy? You said fairies.
Mythical creatures, I think, are pretty important. You've got, Twilight covered from that, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, a lot of stuff. I also don't think this is compulsory, but I think you need one or the other. You either need mythical creatures, or you need magic.
But what do you mean magic, though? Is it anything...
I'm glad you asked. You got sorcerers, witches, visions, prophecies, dreams that are not dreams. When they're like, it wasn't a dream, but it was in my sleep.
Right.
Yeah.
Visions.
I already did say visions as well. Maybe I shouldn't have listed dreams. I also think a feature of fantasy that's kind of to do with magic is the idea that death can be reversed or isn't as permanent as it is in the real world. And that is why I believe ghosts, ghouls, zombies count as fantasy. Do you think zombies count as fantasy?
You're trying to trick me into saying that Walking Dead is fantasy.
Vegard, do you think zombies are fantasy? Answer the question.
It's usually like, oh, this science experiment went wrong and now we have zombies. Or someone was experimenting on a dead body and now it's alive again.
I get what you're saying, but dead bodies can't come to life. I think that's fantasy. That's pure make-believe. I would say aliens, zombies, and then I also wrote down time travel as kind of that kind of grey area. But if an alien can do magic, like E.T., I think that is a fantasy then. But I also think zombies are a common feature in fantasies. For example, in Game of Thrones, you've got the White Walkers, which are the undead creatures that are then brought to life by the Night King. But that's my general definition of fantasy. It either includes mythical creatures of some kind, which usually then involves magic.
Clearly and concisely.
Do you want me to just read the actual definition of fantasy? Fantasy is the faculty or activity of imagining impossible or improbable things. I've already got a character arc written of my zombies is fantasy arc later, so don't you worry about that.
Okay, you have a planned change of mind.
I've got a plan. I was writing about it last night. So now that we have fantasies defined, clear as day, I've never heard a better definition of fantasy by anyone ever. Does modern technology ruin fantasy? I want to get into fantasy part, because I would say the perfect example of a fantasy is a Game of Thrones or a Lord of the Rings. And the reason I think that is because they've built the whole world from scratch. So, for example, Game of Thrones takes place in a world called Westeros. Based on what George R.R. Martin, the author of A Song of Ice and Fire, said, Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire is based on the War of the Roses, which took place in the mid-1400s. So, if we were to kind of take where Game of Thrones in terms of their human development are along, they're about mid-1400s era, so it's quite medieval, which is, I also think, an important feature. And that's kind of the same with Lord of the Rings. It takes place on Middle-earth, which could potentially be our planet. I don't know if that's fundamentally clear, but it's just tens of thousands of years ago. I think peak Game of Thrones because obviously everyone knows about the fall off of Game of Thrones. You don't even have to have seen Game of Thrones to know about that. Peak Game of Thrones, I think that's as good as fantasy can be. I'm talking like season 3, season 4. I'm even not a hater of season 5, season 6. But those think there's other good examples of it done well while it's still taking place in our world. So like, you've got Harry Potter, which does take place in the human world that we live in now, but it's separated away, which is kind of like a stroke of genius that I don't know if it was done by accident. Percy Jackson kind of did the same thing, and I think Percy Jackson took a lot of inspiration from Harry Potter, but I think Percy Jackson's was more intentional because it saw what Harry Potter did and got right. So Percy Jackson kind of has this thing where you can't have a phone if you're a demigod, because it means the demons will kill you. I forgot what they're called, but there's like these evil creatures that want to come out and kill you, which immediately takes away this modern technology that otherwise they'd have access to. I think there are 2 bits of technology that can ruin fantasy: phones and guns. The ones I described earlier, Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, while they are the epitome of fantasy, in my opinion, also fit into the subgenre of fantasy, sword and sorcery, which is what I kind of picture fantasy to be. It's this magical features, and you have the hero wielding a sword. Guns kind of take away that. Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, while both taking place in the real world, remove these elements and kind of stick to this sword and sorcery. Percy Jackson, more specifically, he is known for wielding a sword. So yeah, I think there's a lot of credit needed to give to Harry Potter and Percy Jackson and how they do it. Despite taking place in the real world, they like extract the fantasy elements and then create their own fantasy world inside the real world, I guess. Another one I wrote down, just want to talk about, was like something like Lost, which I think is kind of in the same bracket.
We had a big drunk discussion about this.
Because I think Lost is fantasy. Well, it is definitely fantasy.
Yes.
But Lost does the same thing, I believe, just more subtly. They get stranded on an island, and therefore phones are useless. Guns are useful until you're out of ammo.
I think the golden thing about Lost, when it wasn't full on just craziness, was that you kind of didn't know if it was just people going crazy on an island.
Yeah. To be honest, for me, Lost is like top 5 shows of all time for me. I genuinely love it. I think that's like J.J. Abrams' masterpiece. All those things that we spoke about very highly are where they kind of remove the technology away, or there's just no technology because the equivalent of where they are in human existence is thousands and thousands of years ago. Why does adding this technology into fantasy genre make it worse, I guess? The best conclusion I can reach is because modern science is actually the closest thing we have to real magic.
Wow, Seamus.
It's like very funny in Percy Jackson specifically that they removed cell phones, but because the Greek gods had a way of communicating like phones back in the day, they could like talk to each other through puddles. If someone invented we can communicate with people through this magic puddles where I can talk to someone in a puddle on the other side of the world, I'm like, great, I can call them on FaceTime.
Also, traveling isn't that impressive, because how fast can you fly?
Oh, I've got a broomstick that I can fly on. Funny thing is, I know you haven't seen the film, but this is basically the entire plot of Pixar's movie Onward that came out in 2020. Basically, the idea is that the world was magical and they all did magic to do things. And they just invented this technology that then replaced magic in their universe. So people stopped doing magic. So they used to have like magic sticks where they could create fire. And then they just invented, we can just create like stoves and gas stoves to cook food. I'm going to be honest, a part of me cringes when I see them do something like that. Onward I think is a great film because of the dynamic between the boys and their dad. That's always what I think about when someone goes, you can mix modern technology and magic. Yeah, you can, but I don't think it works. Because it's always going to either be this rivalry between the two of them, or as they kind of reach in the conclusion of Onward, we can combine the two of them together. I think the best way to do it right now, and the thing people do right now, and I think this is seen through like Twilight and other stuff like that, is by focusing on the creatures, because they could still exist. And I think like that's why there was a big vampire werewolf craze, because you can still have like mobile phones and stuff. But in terms of like sorcery, this has just sprung to mind and it's completely off topic, but I think does it quite well, Wizards of Waverly Place. Yeah. But I think that's just because the stakes aren't there. Guns, as I brought up earlier, are a massive feature because as a weapon, they do more damage than most fantasy weapons can do. Why learn to do Avada Kedavra when you can just own a gun? This is the plot of Onward. Onward did have something right. I just found it cringe the way it tried to say they gave up on magic. I can see where the ideas spawned from. I just feel like parts of it weren't executed right, I guess. So you need to sort of suspend your disbelief when watching like a modern fantasy. But maybe sometimes it's just too difficult to do. Marvel is an interesting one actually on that topic, because some of the movies are just outright sci-fi. Like I would take Iron Man. Billionaire builds himself a suit that shoots bullets, like shoots lasers and stuff, right? There's no fantasy elements in there, but then they just introduce like 4. So it very much like blurs the line a little bit. I think Stranger Things is the perfect example though, and the reason why this is successful, and when you asked me earlier, how do you do it? Stranger Things is how you do it. Because when you look at Eleven, her powers aren't like, oh, she has a magic wand where she can like zap someone with Avada Kedavra and kill them. Because the premise of that is pointless, because people have guns so they can just shoot you. And it's kind of the same with superhero movies. They have there's something about the character that she can do that nothing else can do. As we said in Onward, which I think is a perfect example of like them trying to put them up against each other, they've proven that all of this technology that they've created is in a replacement of magic. So the only reason they want to bring magic back is just for the thrill of it, almost.
Because everything kind of already works.
Everything kind of already works, exactly. Stranger Things is the one example in recent years, I would say in the last 5 years, of a fantasy that I've seen that is pretty much perfect for me. I think it's the Dungeons and Dragons feature, kind of leaning into the modern perception of fantasy. And there was also like about 10 years ago that era of just teen dystopian movies, but I don't know if they count as fantasy. I've kind of changed my mind on zombies, I feel, because it might count as its own genre, because I would argue superheroes are their own genre.
Wow, is this your scripted character arc?
Yeah, it is. And I think it's the same with superheroes. Because as I said, some of the MCU movies are just full-on sci-fi. Others of them have fantasy elements. Also, I found this interesting. I was on the Disney Plus official page, and some of the Marvel movies are listed as like sci-fi action, and others of them have fantasy as part of the listing. So there's a definitional thing that someone's made a decision at Disney for. So I'm curious what they list Lost as on Disney Plus. Lost is listed as a fantasy on Disney Plus. Is The Walking Dead? No, The Walking Dead is survival, drama, and horror. That's very light. So, some of you might be wondering, Seamus, how are you talking about Lost and The Walking Dead being on Disney Plus? That's just factually incorrect. I live in America, and I can tell you for a definitive fact that Lost and The Walking Dead are not on Disney Plus. Well, my friend, it seems like we have a problem, because you clearly are not using Surfshark VPN. Oh my god, yes, this is how I'm going to fit the sponsor in today's video. You see, if you're in America and your Disney Plus is looking like this, not very fun, boring. You don't even have Keeping Up with the Kardashians on there.
Wait,
what's the point?
They don't have Kardashians?
They don't have Kardashians on Disney Plus. What's the point on Disney Plus if you don't have the Kardashians on there? But if you get Surfshark, a very cheap browser extension, you can change your location to, well, for example, where I'm from, and then you can access all of the stuff we have on Disney Plus here through that simple click of a button. This also doesn't just work on Disney Plus. You can do it on Netflix, Amazon Prime, what other streaming services are there?
Rakuten TV.
Yep, you can do this on Rakuten TV. And best of all, you know what? Set Surfshark aside. You can have unlimited devices all through one account. Meaning if you split it between a few of your friends and family, you're basically paying nothing. And even with that said, it's already very cheap just for one person to use. So since this is amazing and you're obviously interested and about to click the link in the description down below, I just want to let you know before you do that, you can use my code GORMAN, GORMAN, for a massive 83% off, plus an extra 3 months for free and a 30-day money-back guarantee. So there's literally no risk to try it out for yourself. Again, link in the description down below, use my code GORMAN, and yeah. So in conclusion, the world is changing, and I guess fantasy is too. I still think there's going to be a place in fiction for that like medieval fantasy genre, which I think is the best genre of fantasy, where it's just a whole world completely separate from everything. But there is just kind of a new era of fantasy we've entered with this kind of modern fantasies like the Marvel movies, like Stranger Things, or even like Harry Potter and Percy Jackson, where they're kind of extracting themselves from the real world and entering this kind of technology-free fantasy land in the real world. Why are we doing deep? We don't do deep conclusions here. What are we even trying here? Let's just end this with a joke. You should check out my TikTok. I've got great content coming out for you next week. I'm going on a big content holiday. You guys should check that out. I think you're going to be very excited for that. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, watch another video, check out my Patreon in the description down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.